Hello and welcome to Contemplations of the Lotus Eaters, where we take a topic that isn't necessarily tied to current events, but we feel is valuable and interesting. And I'd like to take a minute to say thank you for all the suggestions for the new name, but we went through them all and settled on Contemplations. I'm here with Hugo and I'm Josh, and we're here today to talk to you about city-states in European history. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about the idea about introducing city-states in the modern day.
Right, so city-states in European history, that's kind of a topic that is a bit obscure maybe, but I feel like it's important today, and I feel like I should mention upfront why I think it's important so that we have actually a reason to talk about this, right?
Sure.
And so today it feels like with the world of nation states that we live in, and then in particular in the last decade or so, there has been criticism from basically any side of this kind of model of the nation state, and the criticism varies, right? You can have one side that says that there is a tension between kind of popular democracy and then globalization or globalism, right? And so that's a problem that they see. And so from the other side, you see criticism of the nation state as being like an oppressive thing, a class-based system that can kind of perpetuate injustice and inequality, and so that kind of criticism. So and variants of these are just coming from every side, right? Mm-hmm. And so if that's the situation that we find ourselves in now, we might as well look at some alternatives that have been there to the nation state in history, and just look at how they're fared and what they were about and how we can actually imagine them, because now we're in the situation where we almost can't imagine something different than nation states, because it's something that we grew up in, that's everywhere around us, right?
I've always thought that it's really strange how we've just kind of come to a consensus that the nation state is the unit of government, if that is the right way of putting it.
Yeah.
It seems like it would have emerged organically, but it is something that's quite contrived.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's quite new, actually, right? It's not something that has been there for long in history, especially if you look at it from kind of a longer historical kind of periodic point of view, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, and so this kind of nation state, it's becoming more and more clear to a lot of people that it's trying to have a one-size-fits-all solution to some problems in society that you have to have different approaches to, based on where you are, who you are, and the context of your kind of situation, right? And so this kind of model obviously cannot satisfy everyone, otherwise you wouldn't have that kind of criticism. And so we'll look at city-states because of that, because it's kind of an interesting example that was practiced throughout history and was kind of also successful throughout history. And this is going to be a kind of a selective discussion. We can't cover everything, so I've picked out several examples of periods in history and of city-states, or a number of city-states in history that are kind of good to as an introduction into this, right? And so the kind of background story of that is that we're used to living in the world of nation states. This world is quite recent. It's actually very, very recent if you think about it, because it's only been kind of fully in place since decolonization. Before decolonization is in like the 50s, 60s, 70s. It used to be a world of kind of empires or colonial powers that had their colonies that were part of those states, but not exactly. So it was a kind of a different arrangement, right? And so it wasn't a nation state as we think about it today, as in, okay, you have an idea of a cohesive culture or nation, and that's where the state is, and it's not somewhere else, because that would be colonial or something like that, right? And so before that, it was slightly different. So it's actually very new. It's only a couple of decades old, and so it used to be even less so in place before World War One, because before only after World War One you had this kind of realignment towards democracy in large parts of the world, in particular in Europe, right? And so before that you had a different world, basically. That it wasn't like the idea of a nation state was very kind of, it wasn't foreign, but it was not typical, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people kind of lose when they look at history from a modern perspective, is that we project our notion of the nation state being something that has gone back in time, perhaps even 2,000 years, whereas it was viewed as a little bit more nuanced than that originally.
So if I'm saying it used to be there before the First World War a little bit, well, it wasn't there almost at all before the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, right? That was kind of the basic starting point of that's why this is all called like Westphalian states and everything. So this is just like the origin point, the kind of mythical origin point of the modern nation state, right? And so before that, it was just something else, right? The world was organized differently in a political sense, and so that's why we want to kind of highlight that model of the city state that used to be there throughout history, before 1648, but then also after, and we're going to be talking about also what city states are like today or in the future. That's going to be for tomorrow, right? And so let us start with the first kind of example that I picked, which is the Greek city states, and those are kind of famous. Those are in kind of creation myth of the Western culture, right?
Sure.
So the whole kind of area of ancient Greece was famous for these city states, and city states were examples of civilization and of progress, and they are still being seen as such today, as kind of sources of what became our modern civilization. And so in Greece you had more than 1,000 city states throughout Greek history, ancient history. And it was usually the model of you had a city, and then you had a surrounding countryside, and that was the political unit. And so you had one population center where, like, a center of power, right? And so the countryside would be something to support the city, but not necessarily just to produce everything that the city needs, because you had trade, of course. And but it would be that would be the model. So a city and a bit of countryside halfway to the halfway line to the next city, right?
Sure.
Something like that, like conceptually. And so those cities in Greece were usually completely self-ruled, but they didn't have any single kind of constitutional model or anything like that. Or model of governance. They had very different systems, and so that's what usually comes up with in like stories about Athens versus Sparta and things like that.
Yeah,
right?
they structured their governments very differently. Obviously, the Spartans had two kings, whereas the Athenians, at least in some parts of their history, actually elected people to lead them.
Yep. Yeah, well, and so you had this kind of melting pot, right? It's kind of a cliche phrase, but well, you had this melting pot of different systems, and different systems were differently useful and differently successful in history. And so then some city states emulated those that were successful and those that became kind of powerful in Greece, right? And so the primary reason for why this actually came about, the situation of a city state instead of a cohesive empire, was, I think, because of geography, and a lot of people think that as well. This is the map of Greece, geographic map of Greece. You can see it's all mountains, all kind of scattered all over, and that offers you kind of protection from. It's very difficult to conquer the whole area, right? Because it's difficult to move from one place to another. It takes you a long time. It's difficult to move armies, and so yeah.
As Mussolini found out in World War II.
Right, and so this is if this is how it came about then, well, then what was there later, right? So let's move on from Greek city-states to Italian city-states. So those were there from the beginning of the Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome, from 5th century onwards, let's say, to the unification of Italy of 1861. So a kind of span of over 1,000 years. You had the kind of varying city-states and their different settings in Italy. There's a map here of what it looked like in 1494. So these cities were kind of the centers of civilization, right, in the medieval world. Like so Europe was kind of all over the map, let's say politically, and it wasn't. It was kind of shattered after the end of the Roman Empire, after the fall of the Roman Empire, and so Italy became over time this kind of center of civilization in like after that as well. And so this was how it looked. It wasn't a single entity. It was multiple separate states, and they kind of shifted around, shuffled around over the centuries. But this is what the setup was.
Yeah, and it seems like particularly the northern Italian city-states seem to be really good examples of a city-state success, because I know the Republic of Venice seemed to be particularly powerful around the medieval period, where they controlled a decent part of the Mediterranean and were one of the strongest Mediterranean powers, I think, largely through trade, wasn't it? And you've also got the fact that the Renaissance originated in northern Italy, so the innovation seems to originate from these city-states, which then spread to the rest of Europe.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can see here that the Republic of Venice is quite expansive, actually, in northern Italy, and also on the coast of Croatia, and that's after several centuries of development, where it started originally as a small town, as a proper city state, and grew into an empire, quote unquote, like structure that is just up there. And so yeah, you had a lot of these. As I said, this is just a situation at one point in history. It's all shifted around. It wasn't like that for a millennium, of course. And so as you said, that's an important point, that it was a source of the Renaissance came from this political turmoil, let's say. So it looks like there's a lot of chaos and disorder, right? But it's not like that, right? It's a lot of self-governing entities, and that obviously talked to each other and traded with each other, or sometimes warred with each other and had conflicts over resources and over influence. But this whole thing created a civilization that produced the Renaissance and advancements in culture and technology, and in politics as well.
Sure. And just to pick out the fact that you mentioned they warred with one another, I'm relatively ignorant of the history, but I'm kind of under the impression that the individual city-states warred less. I know that's not so much the case in ancient Greece, where they seem to love being at war with one another, but I think at least in the case of Italy, it seems like they warred a little bit less with one another because they were a bit more separated. But it's difficult to really tell.
Well, in Greece, it was quite interesting, because war was kind of sport, right? So you took your army and you tried it on the city next door, and you saw whether it worked or not. Maybe it didn't. It was awful, obviously, because wars are, but it was also this playful thing, quote unquote, which is weird. But you can see that it wasn't really that serious, the kind of conflicts between those city-states in Greece, because then you had, for example, the era of the Persian threat to Greece.
Sure.
And then, so if you had the outsiders, the Persians, coming in and warring against Greek city-states, the city-states that used to be enemies would band together or form alliances just to repel that outside threat, and then they could go back to warring among themselves, right?
They certainly had some form of warrior culture, didn't they, where they kind of had a mutual respect for their enemies, and they wouldn't have the same kind of all or nothing attitude that we might have in the modern day.
Yeah. I mean, then if we go forward then to the medieval era or the modern era, like before World War One, the way that you conducted warfare was very different than to the idea of the total war of the First World, that began with the First World War. Because before that, it was usually, not always, it was usually conflicts between some nobles that took their stashes of money and just throw them around in creative ways to circle around the other noble and just battle for influence like that. And civilians weren't usually involved, and there wasn't any widespread destruction if that wasn't the point, which it usually wasn't.
Yeah, I think is the the technology developed, it seems like the stakes got a lot higher, and therefore this kind of relaxed attitude to warfare kind of disappeared along with it, understandably.
Yeah, right. And so it's interesting if we go back to the Italian city-states, if we look at those and compare them with the rest of the Europe that was feudal and monarchical, and that kind of structure, which was very different to what Italy was like back then. And so if you compare those two, you can see which ones were more successful and less successful, and so in particular in kind of the economic sphere. So which ones became much richer and which ones kind of were left behind or stayed behind, let's say. So I've got a quote here. It is estimated that the per capita income of northern Italy nearly tripled from the 19th century to the 15th century. This was a highly mobile, demographically expanding society fueled by rapidly expanding commerce. And so the number is triple from 11th century to the 15th century, which we can say, okay, it's kind of slow for today's standards, but for the standards of pre-modern society, let's say, that was very, very significant.
Well, yeah, in the Middle Ages there was a lot of economic stagnation, and in some cases there was actually a decrease in wealth over time in some areas, just by the lack of innovation and the lack of change. It was very stable, but it also wasn't very good for the economy. It was all very subsistence and living.
It's important to stress that this isn't GDP. This is GDP. This is income per capita, right? And so often the arguments are that you had the plague, and after the plague you had where a large portion of the population died off in the 1300s. Then you had a rise in a standard of living just because you had a lot of stuff around, you had a lot of wealth around for fewer people because a lot of them died, and so you had a rise in standard of living. Sure, but that's kind of a brutal way to get there, right? And so this was something else. So this kind of tripling from the 11th to the 15th century is in per capita income. So that's an important point to stress, that it wasn't something like, okay, we're gonna kill off, or a lot of people are gonna die, and then we can the stuff that we have can be divided with each person having more, right?
I find the notion that lots of people dying somehow benefited those surviving to be a kind of weird idea, because you would think that if a large portion of the population died, surely that would mean that there would be loads of unoccupied professions and the economy would be severely damaged by this.
Oh yes, but like you had a withdrawal of supply, but also you had withdrawal of demand, right?
Sure.
So if you talk about the physical stuff, so the amount of whatever machinery, factories, tools, whatever, this all, or houses, everything, you had the same stock because that didn't die, but you had fewer people. So you had so that amount of stuff was there to be divided, or to be conceptually divided among fewer people.
Sure. And I imagine that the proportion of people who died who were producing a large amount of kind of goods were probably fewer than the people who were very poor. Like, diseases spreading through a society tend to target the poorest to kind of
but
anthropomorphize them a bit.
I think that's largely a modern phenomenon, though, because before you had advanced medicine and medical procedures, you didn't have a way to save a person that had a lot of money to kind of get experts and get people who are like in high demand and who can do something that is life-saving but very difficult. You didn't have that because like it was you were more likely to die in a hospital than not in a hospital.
What I was thinking more so was that even in the past, poorer people would live in denser proximity to one another, and therefore the potential for things to spread, and also the fact that they'd be living in far less hygienic conditions than people with a lot of money, might mean that they would be more susceptible, particularly to something like the Black Death, which is spread through rats.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's definitely true. And it's just also worth pointing out that sorry, it's also worth pointing out that that the Black Death was spread throughout Europe through merchants traveling around and spreading that, right? So that was the source, let's say, quote unquote. But then it spread among, of course, the people who were living in bad conditions primarily. That much
Sure.
is definitely true, right? And so we've gone over a little bit over the Italian city states a little bit. So let's move over to free imperial cities, which was mainly a German thing within the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was a loose political unit that was in place throughout the Middle Ages, and the looseness of the political unit is very important because the emperor that ruled, quote unquote, ruled over this empire was very weak and often couldn't control large portions of the empire, didn't have direct control. And so there wasn't this kind of centralization of power that would be effectively enforced, right? And so that's quite important. And the other important point in regards to the weakness of the structure was that emperors were competing with popes over power in Europe. And so you had the Pope in Rome that would be the center of Christianity and would be the ultimate legislator for everyone who's Christian, and every political unit that declared itself as Christian. But then you had the emperor, who was not supposed to be a religious kind of figure, but who would aim to have the same amount of kind of influence or larger influence over people in that area. And so the Holy Roman Empire was kind of famous for this clash between the popes and the emperors, and that produced a quote unquote vacuum of power, which is a phrase that I don't like to use that often, but you can see in this kind of example how it's what it can produce, right? Because often what is often said about the absence of kind of a power center is that you'll have chaos emerging, and you won't have the stability that you need for kind of civilization. But that was not the case here, because you had local structure that emerged that were kind of smaller, and that in a lot of ways emulated the previous city states in Italy or in Greece before that, right? And so the free imperial city was something that was a political unit, a city state that was directly subordinated to the emperor and not to a local prince that ruled over some kind of area in the whole Roman Empire. And that was the important characteristic of the city. So that it was only subordinated to the emperor, which had very weak control because of the reasons we talked about, right? So that was kind of an interesting situation.
Okay. I mean, I don't really know very much about the Holy Roman Empire and that sort of thing, but it sounds like there was an emperor who ruled over all of these tiny, disparate states, and were they kind of almost like vassal states in that he didn't have complete legislative control, for want of a better way of putting it, as in they still had some degree of self-government,
Mm-hmm.
but he was like the figurehead who had some degree of control over things and probably raised some taxes as well, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, he would try to raise taxes from those states, but he often wasn't able to properly, and he had almost no legislative control. So it was, as I say, very loose, and you're right in characterizing it as that. And yeah, so in that environment, the free imperial cities were of an exception to those kind of local princes, because they had their own self-governance as those cities, contrasted with the countryside, which was directly subordinated to the prince that would be in a castle somewhere and just ruling over an area, right?
Okay.
Or
So it's
many cities were like that as well, but some of them had this kind of status.
almost like a feudal system, but on a much smaller scale.
Well, I don't know what you mean exactly.
As in, there's like an aristocrat who rules over some land and is kind of the owner, so to speak, and then all of the other people have to either work for him or pay tribute in some way.
Yep. Oh yeah, yeah. It was not like the feudal system. It was literally the feudal system. So that makes it easier. So yeah, but so you had these islands of kind of self-governance in that feudal system. Within that feudal system. So I've got a quote here that I want to read. That is from the encyclopedia. So, quote, meanwhile, the free towns had been winning valuable privileges in addition to those which they already possessed. And the wealthy among them, like Lübeck and Augsburg, were practically imperia in imperio, waging war and making peace and ruling their people without any outside interference. But they had also learned that union is strength. They formed alliances among themselves, both for offense and for defense, and these Städtebünde had an important influence on the course of German history in the 14th and the 15th century. These leagues were frequently at war with the ecclesiastical and secular potentates of their district, and in general, they were quite able to hold their own in these quarrels. So you can see that like they had their autonomy. That's what they're trying to say. That they had their self-governance, and they were also aware that they need to form alliances to kind of hold their own against the local princes and against the emperor as well in some ways. And so they would form these alliances of these free imperial cities to kind of survive, because they were it's quite small compared to the countryside, and so they needed some way to keep their power.
It seems like the same sort of behaviour you'd expect from a nation state, but just scaled down to a much smaller level.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and so then I've got one picture of these imperial cities. It was in 1648. So this is already after the peak. So you can see that it's mainly in Germany. Most of them are in southern Germany, and so it's. As I say, this was after the peak. Before, like 100 years earlier, let's say that there would be many more of them, but I couldn't find a good map for the peak. So this is still good. You can see there's dozens of them kind of, in different parts of Germany.
Okay.
Right, and let's move on to the Hanseatic League, because that's kind of an interesting special case. It was a confederation of merchant guilds and market towns from the 13th to the 17th century, and it had a peak at around 1450. So it was kind of similar to the free imperial cities, and some free imperial cities were actually in the Hanseatic League. So it was kind of all was merging together in some ways. And so this map is from around 1400. And so what was that league for? It was for trading and defense purposes, right? And so you had these cities that would be independent in some ways, and they would band together to protect their interests, which were mainly commercial, along the northern Baltic seas, right? So those trade routes, and so they would control the trade in those two seas.
So on this map, these different colours represent an area controlled by a specific city-state then?
Not exactly. Those are... there was a number of city-states, much more than those.
Okay.
But those are regions or kind of sections of the Hanseatic League. So the whole coloured kind of area is the area of influence of the Hanseatic League.
Okay.
But each of the colors had different cities within it that were part of the league.
So it's like a coalition, but within that there's kind of like a sub-coalition between the different city-states within these certain
It was
areas.
divisions within the league.
Okay, yeah.
And so from Wikipedia, quote, the league had a fluid structure, but its members shared some characteristics. Most of the Hansa cities either started as independent cities or gained independence through the collective bargaining power of the league, though such independence remained limited. So you had some of those which were, for example, the free imperial cities, which had complete independence and only in some ways were subordinated to the Holy Roman Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And then you had some cities which had more limited independence, but which had some special privileges granted to them, and those privileges were kind of protected by the League, because those were the shared interests of each of the individual cities, kind of fighting back against the local rulers that they didn't want them to be ruled over, right?
Okay, so it seems like a system of checks and balances almost.
In a way, yeah. Like this was a way to kind of guard your interests against the local rulers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, or local the rulers of the dominions and of the kingdoms that were there as well, right? So this isn't borders. This is kind of a sphere of influence, and so overlapping this were borders of the Holy Roman Empire, and within that of different states or political units within it, and then outside of the Holy Roman Empire, you had also different kingdoms and domains, and against these kind of rulers were what the Hanseatic League was primarily focused against.
Okay.
Right, and so it was, as I said, it was a confederation of guilds, and so some of the cities were established as like the guild cities, and those would be completely within the Hanseatic League, and some of the cities would be would only have kind of a part of that city being the guild part of the city, which was where the trade would take place, and that would be ruled by the Hanseatic law, because the Hanseatic League had its own law, which was sometimes the only law in the city, but sometimes it would kind of interact with the local laws of the local kingdoms and dominions.
Okay, so these Hanseatic laws would only apply to some areas within these specific kingdoms then, and then there would be other areas where they had their own self-government, for want of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, and it's the important part is that you had you had these cities that were kind of together in this league, but also each of them had different arrangements with their local rulers, right, with their local kingdoms, and so this was very complicated, and each of them had different conditions and different kind of legal systems a little bit, and different interaction between the legal system of that kingdom and of the Hansa law that was in place throughout the league. And so and then you had another complicating factor in that, which was that often the law didn't apply geographically but personally. So you were subject to German law, for example, right? And so you wherever you went, you would be kind of you would be part of that unit, even though you were on the grounds of the Hansa outpost, for example, somewhere else.
So the law didn't necessarily apply to geographical areas, but the individuals who lived in those areas. So you would still follow the laws that applied to you, even if you travelled beyond the boundaries of where those applied. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding?
That would be if it was completely like that, but it wasn't wholly like that. It was a combination of all of these factors coming together, and the concrete kind of application of what you follow where would depend on where you are and when you are, and what kind of arrangements are there between the local rulers and the merchant guild and everyone else. So it was very kind of complicated, but also most people didn't move out of their towns within their lives, right? And only a few people, like traders, would travel between cities. So this was a very. It wasn't really important to have this kind of continuity or kind of clarity or transparency over a large territory, because that wasn't something that would be relevant for most people.
Sure.
Right, and so yeah, as we said, there was an internal Hansa law for settling disputes. It applied to town inhabitants and merchant guild members, or to areas that were controlled by the guild. And so from Wiki, I'm quoting, the Hanseatic cities had their own legal system and they operated their own armies for mutual protection aid. Despite this, the organization was not a state, nor could it be called a confederation of city-states. So because a lot of those cities were subject to their own local kingdoms and to their own local rulers, you couldn't call them properly city-states, but they had some privileges that they won for themselves because of the league, because of that kind of confederation that was formed among trading partners.
Sure.
Right.
So they were city-states in some ways, but not others,
Yes.
and they gave that up to be part of the Confederation. So, as in, they had to make some concessions to be a part of that Confederation. Is that right?
No. The Confederation was that to protect their status as some kind of city-states. Right?
Okay.
But they were also forced not to be proper city-states by their own local rulers, right? By
Okay.
their own membership in their respective kingdoms. Right, and so yeah, this is another look at them. So you can see that it's much more cities than the areas previously in those colors, and this is also only a small part of them. You had loads of small cities that are not shown on this map, but this is kind of the extent of it, and some of the cities that exist until up until today. So. Right, so that's about the Hanseatic League, and so what's the kind of point of talking about all this? Like, what have we learned? Right, I think we've learned that from just one example of different governance model, which is the city state rather than the nation state. We can see that if we just look at city states, we can see that throughout European history there have been this model has been stable and has been in place in some way or another in different regions all over Europe throughout history from the antiquity and until today. And so these kind of alternative governance structure are long lasting as well, and sometimes and often predate the nation state, right? And so if as we have done in the Italian city states, if we compare them against those kingdoms or empires that were in Europe at the same time, those were typically the city-states or smaller units were typically the centers of wealth and culture in their respective civilizations, right? And so that's kind of an important point, that these are the places that are notable now for what they had achieved in the past, right? So that's an interesting view at governance or alternative governance structure. And so I think the reason for their success in this way is that they were smaller, and so they needed to compete for their citizens and customers, right? Because people could just leave easily because it was only a short distance before they reached another political unit, and so it was the same culture, maybe same language, so they could they needed to do a better job at attracting people and keeping people interested in their kind of project.
So there was greater accountability for the so-called government.
Yep.
And it meant that people could just leave if they didn't agree with how things were being run, and that would damage the people ruling. So they had more of an interest to satisfy the needs of the citizens.
I mean, it's of course, that's what I meant, yes. But we have to say the caveat that it's not just as easy as just taking your things and moving, because often you were prevented from moving by feudal law if you were a peasant somewhere. So that those things would differ based on where you were and what political kind of structure you were a subject of. But the states in history were by far less powerful than the states today, so you couldn't have patrols on every border crossing. That wasn't a thing, right?
Sure.
So things like that were in some ways easier, but in some ways there were a lot of obstacles still. So you have to say that it wasn't as easy as just taking your stuff and moving. But I wouldn't want to make it seem that way, even though that's kind of what I implied. But the pressures are definitely there if you're a smaller unit that is maybe only a city or maybe a bit of surrounding countryside, than if you're a huge kind of empire where it takes months to travel out of. Right?
Yeah, that seems to make intuitive sense.
Okay, so that's kind of what I would end it today. And tomorrow we'll want to look at how city-states could look today, right? And so there are obviously some city-states that are today, or city-states in some ways, but we'll kind of speculate about the future and talk about the possibilities.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in tomorrow.